Okay, so we're looking at the enrollment. We saw that in the pivot table here that we had enrollment of 30 million. Does that mean that there are 30 million students enrolled across the set of this data? But you could look at it, and you could, and the answer is no, but someone can figure out and say, why? Why is it that we're not talking about 30 million students? So it's like, it's kind of always the first step when you're working with, a set of data. Like, make sure you understand the data that you're working with. And this is simply, you might look at it and you go, oh, yeah, there are 30 million students in this data set. But it's probably about a third of that. That's how many students we really have. There's probably about 10 million students here. Go ahead. Yeah, you're right. And it's 2006 through how many years that we have here? It's only 4 years of data. So you're saying it doesn't pass the sniff test, that 10% of the population would be enrolled in college. Yeah, I think I agree. But what is it? Like, what does that number really mean? And why is it that I'm pretty sure that it's not 30 million students? Besides, it seems like it's too high. Okay, go ahead. Ah, yes. Why are we double counting? Yes. So this is the enrollment at Alabama in 2006. If I was to look at enrollment for Alabama in 2005, how much overlap would there be? About 3/4. Alabama, Auburn is a 4-year institution. So it's probably not quite, there's some attrition and so forth, but there's going to be a lot of double counting there. So, if I was to put a name to that, that is it is the sum of annual enrollment in colleges in the data set. It's tough to put a different name on that one. So, but now at least we're summarized down to that. We're now summarizing that vector of numbers according to one dimension. Let's add another dimension. And so I'll add another dimension here. I'm going to put the state. I'll put that as a column. Okay, so now, if I were to look at this, what does that number mean? Like, someone just say that number in a sentence, what that number means. You could say a sentence now with the number 230 in it, and it could be meaningful. Go ahead.
In Arizona, that was 230 assaults.
Yeah, reported and ultimately reported to the FBI, which is where the data set comes from, in the data set that we have here. So from the years 2006 to 2010, 230 assaults at colleges in Arizona, that are reporting. And this data is only data that's reported on university campuses. Still, our enrollment doesn't make a whole lot of sense here, but we're about to make it make sense, because now I'm going to add one more kind of dimension here. And I'm going to take the report year and I'm going to make that into a filter. Well, before I make it into a filter, let me make it into I'll put it as another column. No, I'll put it as a row. So now I've got like 2 dimensions here on my row. It's got the year, and then it's got the category or the label in here. So now I'm looking at 2006. Now all of a sudden my enrollment numbers make sense. Like I can now talk about a number of students. So now this is saying that in 2006, enrollment at all of the reporting universities of Arizona was 144,000 students. Because now that I don't have multiple years, I've gotten rid of the double counting problem. So and that's what a pivot table does. It says, listen, we want to be able to take this set of numbers and we want to be able to summarize it by multiple dimensions simultaneously. And so we really have 3 dimensions simultaneously now. We have the state, we have the year, and then we have the label that we're summarizing that way. That's why we have so many numbers. And as we add dimensions, we're cutting the groups into smaller and smaller pieces. We get more and more different numbers here. I think I would prefer to have the report year done as a filter. So instead of like showing all those different years, I can pick the year, right? So I could say, let me just see 2006. Then I could show that year. If I really wanted to, I could show all of the years. And I could go right back. Oh, it doesn't divide them out here. It just says, now let's summarize those all together. Or I could say, no, just show 1 year at a time. So now I'm looking at 2008 using this restriction instead of to just show multiple years. All right. And so that's giving me kind of a way to be able to look at this data in a reasonable way. Truth is, I think I probably like the label as a column and the state as a row. Makes the table, I think, a little easier to work with. To go down, have it scroll off the page down instead of to the side. I like it. It's a decent report now. Let me just go ahead and add the state. Let's see, where is the state? Let's add the school in as a sub of the state. So now we're getting the state, and now we're getting the individual schools there. And if we wanted to, we could also put the campus even below that. So when we have multiple campuses, we'll show, here's University of Alabama. It's got Huntsville and Tuscaloosa. And we can see those values are here. They're summarized to the value above it. Looks pretty good. And I might say, you know what? I don't want to see like all these things spread out by default. So maybe I'll just right click here on this name of the school, and I'll choose expand collapse, and I'll collapse entire field. So I'm going to say, don't split out the schools. Oh, I thought that would have done it. Expand collapse entire field. Oh, I must have just clicked wrong before. So now I can see, I can drill down into these. So I can come to University of Alabama and I can open it up to look at it, but it's just showing me the raw data. And I might do the same thing for the state as well. So I'll right click a state, expand collapse, and I will collapse entire field. So now I'm kind of back to where I was before I added in the campus and the college. But now I can drill into it if I like and see the more detail there. And I might like to say, hey, why don't we do it this way? We're interested in, maybe some Intermountain West schools. So I want to see Utah, Wyoming, and Idaho. Where's Idaho? There's no Idaho schools. I guess they don't have college in Idaho. What's that? What does that mean? No colleges in Idaho. Does it mean there's no colleges in Idaho? In this data set, what does it mean? They don't report. But for whatever reason, schools in Idaho aren't reporting to the FBI about this. I don't know if it's some state policy or just happened to be that way. So I guess, do we have Colorado? Okay, so we at least get like 3 Intermountain states. We got Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah kind of spread out. So, and so that's one of the things, like when they added the pivot table into Excel, it was like, wow, this is really great. So we can use Excel now for looking at data in some really, really powerful ways. And it's just fantastic. But let's suppose that, man, this data comes in, we get this data in every month, and we'd like to be able to kind of get this pivot table organized this way. It took us some work to get it organized this way. We'd like to get it organized this way every month. So it would be nice if we could automate the process. And of course, that's what we're doing here today. We're seeing how to automate this. It's not so much about learning how to do a pivot table as it is learning how to automate a pivot table. So here's the pivot table that we've just built. We'd like to automate, to build a sub procedure now that would take the data, regardless of how many rows there are, just take all of this data and be able to build that pre-built pivot table so that someone could come in and start snooping around with it and say, I'd kind of like to drill into the Colorado State, schools and see, how they break out individually right here, or to be able to come in here and say, yeah, let me just change the year. I don't want to look at this year. I want to look at this year and have that change. So we're building the tool much further along, because the truth is, there are lots of people that could use this pivot table once it's built to gain interesting insights about the data, who probably aren't really ready to build it. So whether it's you just being lazy, I don't want to have to build it every time, or you're giving it to someone who's probably not really ready to build it every time. There's lots of reasons that you'd want to be able to automate this process. All right, so we've been through this once. I'm going to go ahead and throw this pivot table away. And we're going to build it again, but this time we're going to record ourselves doing it. And then we'll take a look at the code that gets generated and we'll see how to simplify it. As is often the case with recorded code, the code that gets recorded as we do this exercise is not going to be all that reusable. It's going to take some work on our part to be able to make it that we can use it over and over again. All right, so I've got just the one crime data table. I'm ready to start recording. Come to my developer tab, click record macro. The name is macro1. That's a great name. I guess I'll call it make pivot. Make pivot. It's a even better name. Pivot. And I guess I'll put a capital P on this, so Control Shift P will execute it, and I'll leave it in this workbook. That sounds great. And I'm not going to put a description. We'll say OK. We'll just go through that same process again. So insert pivot table. I'll put on a new worksheet. That sounds great. I'll go through that same process. I'll put the value for the values. I'll put the label as the column. I'll put the report year as a filter. And what did I have? State, and then school, and then campus. Got everything but type. Well, I think type is just a column that says whether it's a crime or it's a whether it's informational. What that would do is it would make it easy for us to be able to look at the total number of crimes reported at a locus. So let's go ahead and put the type as superior to the label. So now we've got two different kinds. We've got informational, which is enrollment, and then we've got crime. So now we're getting a crime total here. That looks pretty good. So I've built that. Oh, and we're going to also do some collapsing here. So let's go ahead and pre-collapse our schools that have multiple campuses. So I'll right-click that one, expand collapse, and collapse entire field. And I'll do the same thing for the schools. Expand collapse, collapse entire field. Then I'll open up 3, Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming. And I'll stop recording. All right, so that should have recorded us all that whole process of building this. Let's take a look. Alt F11 to bring up my code. Made something called modules. Here's module 1. Here's make pivot. All right, so here I like to do a little exercise here. If you're with me, it's not exercise in the right way, but let's look at this. And someone tell me something about this code, the way it was recorded, that says, you know what, that's got to change. We want to make this so that when we get a new set of data, we can run this code and it'll build the pivot table for the new data. So kind of look at what it recorded and say, oh, I can see something that I know has to change. You may not know how to fix it, but just identifying what has to change here. Go ahead. Okay. So what you're saying here is that source data is looking from row 1, column 1 to row 23,164, column 7. The column 7 is probably okay, but it's like this number here. Okay, good. So if I've got new data, it's not going to be the same thing. So we'll fix that one. Oh, and you're saying also it's looking at sheet 2. Why is it looking at sheet 2? Yeah, it created a new sheet. It was sheet 2, and so that's the one it's referring to. And the next time I run this, it's not going to be sheet 2. It's going to make sheet 3, sheet 4. If I were to close Excel, open it again, it would create sheet 1 because it would realize, oh, sheet 1's not here. It would do it, but it's already created sheet 1 in this setting, and so it's not going to create it again. Good. Yeah, so I think those are the 2 main things I wanted you to identify. Nice work. So let's get started working on those. So any thoughts on how we handle the problem with the sheet being hard-coded? Do something, we could change it to be active sheet. I'm always nervous to write code that relies on like the active workbook or the active sheet, because like while the code's running, if the user does something to change the active sheet, it could really make a mess of things. So I'd prefer to avoid just referring to the active sheet, although we could get by with that in a pinch. I think the key is going to be understanding something about what the add method does of the sheets collection. So this adds a sheet, but it also does something else. What does it do besides add the sheet? It returns a reference to the sheet that got added. So if I can capture the reference to the sheet that just got added, I can use that variable to refer to that sheet regardless of which one is active. So let's do this. So I was application cut copy mode is false. I must have had something copied. And when I went to record, it's like, yeah, you can't, you're not in cut copy mode anymore. I'm going to just get rid of that one. And let's just declare a variable. I'm just going to call it S as a worksheet. And now let's set S equal to worksheets.add. So that's going to add a sheet, and we'll now have a reference to it. All right, so now let's look at this next block, this next statement that it's done right here. Actually, it's this right here. Active workbook, pivot caches. Oh boy, what is a pivot cache? This is a really long statement. It's got pivot caches. It's creating a pivot cache, and it's given the arguments that it creates go from there to there. And then whatever that returns, it's creating a pivot table, and it's giving us some information about this. Ooh. So it turns out I can build it in Excel. I can build a pivot table on lots of different kinds of data sources. The way that you're probably most familiar doing it with is like saying, I want to build a pivot table on some data that's sitting here in Excel. And that's what this is. This is an Excel database. The type of this pivot cache is just data here in Excel. But has anyone built a pivot table on something besides data sitting in Excel? And if so, what did you build it on? I get the sense there's like a few different kinds of data sources you can build it on, but the other place that I've built pivot tables on quite a bit is like not on Excel database, but like on a database. Like you can get a connection to some external database and say, read the data off the database and build the pivot table. Well, what it does is it says, first it says, instead of just going from the source data to the pivot table, it's going to create something, an intermediate thing that's designed to work with pivot tables well, called a pivot cache. It's going to store the data in a way that it can very efficiently build pivot tables on. So let's take a look at this. So right now I've got one pivot table. Let me look at this workbook, or just active workbook. Dot pivot caches. Dot count. How many pivot caches are there? Right now there's one. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to build another pivot table on that. I'm just going to come back to my crime data and insert a pivot table. You don't need to do this. You don't need to do this along with me. Great. I've got a new pivot table. I might even just have it actually do something. How many pivot caches do you think I have now? Still just one. And the reason is I have two pivot tables built on the same source data. And so it says, listen, we're going to build a pivot table. We've got to have a pivot cache for it. But if we're going to have 2 or 3 pivot tables built on the same source data, that's what the pivot cache is for. Rather than going back to the source each time to build the pivot table, it says, we've already gone through part of the work to get this data organized in a way that it's ready for building pivot tables. If I was to create another pivot table on a different source data, so instead of doing this on all of my data, let me just get the 2006 data. There's Alaska, 2007, Alabama, Wyoming. Here's my 2006 data. I should be able to build a pivot table on that, and it should be a different source of data. So insert, pivot table, Undo a new table. Make it do something. Now let's see how many pivot caches I have. I've never done this in class before. I'm guessing there's going to be 2. Good. So different set of data that it's using to build that pivot table. So let's build a different pivot cache for it. So I think, so we got to realize that that's a different object that we're going to think about separately. There's this thing called a pivot cache. And I don't think we want to be creating pivot caches if there's already a pivot cache built on the data that we're going to build this on. So we might create 3 or 4 different pivot tables here. We want to identify, is there already a pivot cache built for this? So let's just kind of look and see like what our source data property is for one of these. So let me say our pivot caches dot item sub 1 dot source data. And let's print that. So that's telling me, that pivot cache is built on that source data. If I look at my second one, it's built on some different set of source data. So I think our first step is going to be, before we just launch off and create a pivot table, let's check to see if we need to create a pivot cache or if there's already sufficient pivot cache in place. All right, so that's the active workbook, or we'll use this workbook because it's going to be the one that's holding the code. So let's do this. Let's dim PC as a pivot cache object. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to iterate across all of the pivot caches in the workbook and see if there's a pivot cache that's already built on the data that I'm trying to summarize. So let me just see if I can make a loop that will print off what those data sources are. So I'm going to go ahead and do this with a for each loop. So let me say for each PC in this workbook dot pivot caches. Debug.print PC dot source data. Does a pivot cache have a name? I'm not sure if pivot cache has a name. Doesn't look like it has a name. That's okay. I'll go ahead and put a breakpoint here. I'll just stop, write a breakpoint in code, and I'll run it to there, and that should print off the data sources for the 2 pivot caches that are there right now. And so, yep, we've got the one that's the whole data set, and we've got the one that's the smaller data set. So now we've just got to figure out, how can we look at those sources and figure out, do we already have a pivot cache that's built for that, that's built on the one that we're after? So we better figure out which one we're after. I'm going to come back to my data. How do I want to identify, how do I want to make sure I've gotten to the right data? Any thoughts? And presumably, I'm going to say, listen, you're going to have a sheet called crime data. That'll be the name of the sheet. And the data is going to start in A1. So how would I, knowing that information, how would I get to all of the data on this sheet? Go ahead. I could use the used range. That's not how I was going to do it. I was going to use current region, which is like hitting Control A. But use range, assuming that it is in the format I'm expecting, use range will be the same thing. You suggested it, we'll use it. All right, so let's go ahead and let's just go ahead and make a range called data. So let me dim RNG, let me dim data as a range. And you know what, we probably shouldn't be adding our sheet yet. I'm going to move our add sheet down after our breakpoint. So we've got a range. Now let's bind that range onto something. So let's set data equal to our used range of a sheet called crime data. So this workbook, worksheets, we're looking for the one called crime data. Is that what it was called? Crime data, yep. Dot used range. Okay, so that's going to give us data.address. I'm going to stop my code and run it again to that point. That looks pretty good. A1 to G23164. Oh, bad news. It's giving it to us in a different format. But I should be able to actually get this and use this to bind this to a particular range object. And I think if I do that, it's going to give me allow me to refer to the address the same way. Let's just find out. Let me see if I could identify a range with this name. Range. Treat that as a string and ask for the address. Range crime data. Wondering if it's going to require me to split this. Will it take that? Doesn't like that, unfortunately. So let's address. Do we have address that brings that address in the R1C1 format? That's ugly. All right. So it looks like we don't have the luxury of just being able to use that address the way that it gets reported from the source data property of the pivot table. So I think we're probably okay, assuming that we've got row 1, column 1 here. It's going to start there. So let's just identify that if it ends in the right location, if it ends in like that row of that column, we found the pivot cache with the right one. It's a little more work with. So I've got data now as a range. So let's look at data dot rows dot count 23164. 23164. So I found that part of it. I should also be able to look for data.columns.count. That gives me the 7. I should be able to build this up. So all I really need in front of this is a row. In fact, I need this in front of it. Concatenate that onto there, and then concatenate a C here, and C. And that should give me the string similar to what I'm looking for. So look at that, that's the address that I'm after. So as I loop through this, if that is the, oh, and it's actually crime data in front of that. If that expression produces exactly what's in one of my pivot cache's source data, I have found the pivot cache I'm looking for. Ooh, kind of ugly. But let's just put an if statement here. If that is equal to my source data of the pivot table, then I found a match. Ooh. So what I want to do if I found a match. Well, because I'm binding my pivot cache object variable onto each one of these pivot caches as I go through the set, if I just exit the loop here, PC will still be bound on to the pivot cache that it found. So I can just say exit 4. And so now when it finds the match, it's like, okay, the pivot cache object is already built onto that pivot cache. Just let us out and we'll still be attached onto it. That's the good news. Bad news is if it goes through all of this whole loop and it doesn't find a match, at the end of the loop, the PC variable is going to be attached onto whatever the last one it looked at was. So I'll need something to know, some way to know if it actually found a match in the pivot cache. So I'm going to create another variable up here. I'll just call it found PC as a Boolean. That will start off false by default. And if we found it here, before we exit, let's go ahead and set found PC equal to true. Now we know we have found the pivot cache. So now we can look at the value of PC when we're done in this loop and know, did we find one or not? So now we can say if not found, so if not found PC, then we need to create a pivot cache because there's no pivot cache on the data that we're after. So here's where we're going to say set PC equal to, and we'll just copy everything up to where it says create pivot table. So active workbook, pivot caches, create, that should be good. And our source data should be the same expression that we had up here. Truth is, normally when I create a pivot table, I start by selecting the data. So I'll be curious to see what this does. So I'm going to delete off all of my sheets except my crime data sheet. That'll get rid of all my old pivot tables and pivot caches. And I'm going to put a breakpoint here and run my code. So I expect to get there, and found PC should be false. I don't think we had any pivot caches defined. So found PC is still false. So I'm going to go ahead and step through this. And let's take a look at our pivot cache and see what it built. Like it didn't even build the pivot cache. Active workbook pivot caches.create. All right, so I think in this case, I'm going to build it the way I normally build it, and that is just like we'll start off by selecting the data that we want to build. Is that right? Yeah, I'm going to try let me try something really quick here. So that should be our sheet. This is doing it by a string. I think we can do it just with a reference to a particular array. So I'm going to bring this down. Source data is going to be equal to this workbook. Sheet that we're after is called crime data. Dot used range. I'm just going to try that real quick. Still getting no pivot caches. Let me look at my notes for a second here. Yeah, that looks like it should work. Is anyone getting this to create a pivot cache? Okay, so what is wrong here? Look what pivot caches create. It's not having an error. F8. It's executing that line. See what the source data is coming out as. So it's identifying that range correctly, but it's not creating the pivot table. That's really interesting. Take the example that we recorded. All right, I'm not sure what's happened here. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to create it again. We'll get the pivot table in place. We'll go on to manipulate the pivot. We'll get the pivot cache in place. We'll use it to create the pivot table, and I'll have to track this down. This is behaving differently than it did from my example, even from last semester. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to make sure I've stocked my code. I'll create one pivot table on this. Insert pivot table. That'll generate the pivot cache. At this point, I think I've got a pivot cache. I've got a pivot cache there. So I'm gonna go ahead and delete. I'll leave that sheet in place so I know that I've got that pivot cache in place, and we'll build to get to the pivot table part of this example. So, in fact, I think if I run through here, it'll probably attach onto that just fine. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and run this code again. Should still have one pivot cache. PC found should be true. Okay, so at this point, our pivot cache is attached onto that one. Why this statement's not creating it? I'm at a loss. We'll have to do some research on that and get back to you. But with this code in place, having already built a pivot table, the pivot cache is in place, it's finding it just fine. I should be able to refer to it now by the PC object. Ask for the source data of the PC object. So our pivot cache object is bound onto the pivot cache that's in the workbook. We're ready to move on. Okay. So now we're getting ready to add the sheet. I'm going to stop my code right here. And everything up to this point right here, like this create statement of the pivot cache collection, creates a pivot cache and returns a reference to the pivot cache that was created, which is why I can just say create pivot table, because this evaluates to a pivot cache. But now, instead of creating it, we're just binding on to that existing pivot cache. And now we're going to create the pivot table using that existing pivot cache. So instead of having that there, I'm just going to say PC dot. So that now, rather than create the pivot cache and then create the pivot table based on it, we're going to attach onto the pivot cache and create the pivot table. But I would like to have a reference to that pivot table that gets created. As you might guess, the create pivot table method returns a reference to a pivot table object. So we come up to the top and declare a pivot table, a variable PT as a pivot table. And so now I can set my pivot table equal to this. Now, here's the arguments up to this point. Up to this point right here, here's the arguments that are being passed to the pivot table. And now that I am doing something with the return value of that, I need to put those arguments into parentheses. And I don't really see the need to have that on multiple sheets or on multiple lines. Now my destination I have to adjust here because it's saying to put it in row 3, column 1. That's A3. And it turns out my destination can take either a string that identifies a range, or it can take a reference to a range, which will be a little simpler for me to get. And I want to put this on the sheet that was just added. So I've said add a sheet, captured in S. So here I'll just say S dot cells. What was it? Row 3, column 1. Or I could say S dot range A3. That will refer to the destination. I don't really like that it's giving it a name here. I don't think I'm allowed to have collisions in my pivot table names. So instead of, I think I'm just going to get rid of that argument. And I think it has to come up with some name. If I don't tell it what the name is, it'll just be whatever the default name is, which is fine. Then we're selecting sheet 2. We don't need to select sheet 2 because when we say s.add or sheets.add, it's going to be the active sheet. So I just don't think we need this line at all. So we've really simplified that code that was there. I'll go ahead and move my stop down here. I'll run my code again. So when I run the code this time, it should bind onto the existing pivot cache, add a new sheet. So sheet 7 should show up and it should have the pivot table built onto it. We'll run it. Yeah, here's sheet 7 and it's got a pivot table on it. Excellent. Go ahead and stop my code there and get back to the process of looking through the code that it generated to see what we're going to do. Again, here it's selecting A3. I don't think we need to select that cell. I'm going to get rid of that. And now it's saying we're going to do a bunch of stuff with this object. And tell me, what object is that? That's what kind of object is that identifying? Like when I recorded the code, that identified what? Was it a worksheet, a workbook, a cell, pivot cache, a pivot table? What do you think it is? It's a pivot table. Yeah, that is a reference to the pivot table that we just created. Well, it's not like it's identifying it by name here. We don't even know the name. We could ask the name, but the point is we captured a reference to the pivot table right here. So instead of getting a reference to the pivot table this way, we can just say PT. We said, oh, we create a pivot table. We hold the reference to that pivot table. Now, anytime we have to refer to the pivot table, we've got a variable that does it. Now, the truth is, as I look at all these things that it's doing here, I didn't set any of these things. I just said create a pivot table. So tell me, what do you think this block is doing? Like, why did it record that? These are like the default settings for the pivot table. Like, if I wanted to change these, I could change them here, but it's the default. Like, I don't even think I need this block of code. I'm going to get rid of it too. That was just giving me the defaults. It would have been nice if I thought there was some that I wanted to change, but if I wanted to change them, I would have changed them and seen how the code generated it in the first place. So now this becomes kind of the first meaningful manipulation of our pivot table. Oh, actually, no, it's not. So this is telling us something about the pivot cache. So it's saying, all right, here's our pivot table, and whatever pivot cache is bound onto that it's going to say, don't refresh when the file opens and do this missing limit, whatever this default is. Again, this is default code. It's just going to be the default. I'm going to get rid of that one. Here's the next line. Active sheet pivot tables, pivot table 2, repeat all labels, Excel repeat labels. I don't even know what that does, but I think it's a default. I'm not positive. This is a pretty simple line. I'm going to leave it in place. I'm going to refer to the pivot table not by its name, but by its variable name, PT. So we're setting that up. And now I think here is the first manipulation of the pivot table. Here's a pivot table, and I'm calling, change that to PT. I'm calling the add data field method. Okay, we're going to add a data field. What is this right here? Active sheet pivot tables, pivot table 2. That's a reference to pivot table. Simplify that down to PT. And it's saying it's adding a field, it's adding the pivot field value, calling it sum of value and making it do the Excel sum. That looks great. I think this is giving us our data value field. It's putting our value into the values. And now, look at this next block here. With active sheet pivot tables pivot field label, it's setting it equal to a column field. It's saying we're going to make this to be a column. Sum pivot tables. Pivot field label. It's taking the label. So here we took the value and made it the data field. Now we're adding a pivot field, the label, and we're making it, setting it the column to be, it's a column. We're making the label to be a column heading. That's what it was. And we're setting the position to 1. It's the first one we're adding. It's the only one we're adding. Is it the only one we're adding? I don't remember. It's going to be 1. I don't think I need this line. And as soon as I don't need that line, there's no reason to have the width. It's only one statement. Let me get rid of the width. And I don't need the pivot table this way. That's just PT. I'll bring the orientation up. I don't need the end width. So here I'm setting the value. I'm adding my data field to be the value. And now I'm making an orientation. I'm setting my label to be a column field. Now we're doing the report year. So here's report year. It's the same thing. I don't need position. So I don't need the width and end width. Pivot table is just going to be PT. And that'll be the orientation. So the report year is a page field. That's right. It's going to be the filter that I set which year I want to look at. Doing the next one, PT. Bring up the orientation, get rid of the next 2 lines. And just do that for all of these. PT. State, school, and campus. That's right, 1, 2, and 3. So that's the right, it's going to put those in the right order. Those are kind of tied together. I'm going to go ahead and leave those a little closer together in my code. And then this is a column. Well, that's right, because I added type. Position 1. I'm going to bring this one up to where I'm setting the type. So I'm going to put these 2 types together. And I think what I want is this one to be before my label. So I'm going to have type first and then label. The way it worked before is this one went in as 1, and then this one later went in as 1, I think. So I'm going to put it this way so that the type is on top, the label comes in next. All right, A19. We selected A19. And so here's where we said we're setting the show detail of school to false. So change this to PT. Show detail is false. We don't need to select the field. Showing the detail of the state is going to set to false. So get the pivot table adjusted. And now we're setting Colorado equal to true. I think that's going to be okay. PT, pivot items, Colorado. We're assuming there's going to be a Colorado. It's probably a pretty good assumption, especially if we know we're building on existing data. The next data is going to have this data with it. There will be a Colorado. Don't need to scroll down. Don't need to select that range. Again, pivot table here. Showing for Utah. And we're showing for Wyoming. And we're done. So the code is quite a bit simpler than it was before, even though we're trying to go through and look this up. As I said, I'll have to track down why that's not working the way I expected it to. But as long as there's already a pivot cache there, we should be attaching onto it and building the pivot table. Let's give it a shot. That should give us that fully specified pivot table. And so here it is. Created sheet 8. Yep, it's got my type here at the top, giving me a total crime, total enrollment. It's automatically collapsed everything else except for Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming. The keys here are to realize that when this records, it's going to record using the name of the sheet and the name of the pivot table that was created, and that will not work to just to replay. So we came in and said, let's keep track of the sheet, let's keep track of the pivot table, and then we'll use those objects to refer to the newly created items. Any questions here? By the way, is the same data that we'll be working with for that database project that's coming up. So we've got to get the data off of those worksheets and into a database, but that's what this crime data is, just an export of that database that we're dealing with. So again, we're getting a little bit of practice working with the data that's going to be for that particular project. All right, let's call that good for here. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes and see if I can figure out why that pivot cache isn't actually connecting up the way that it should. And then hopefully I'll have that in the video to post. Any questions? In the back, go ahead. Interesting question. What's my favorite color? I don't know that anyone has a favorite color. Might have a suite of favorite colors. The favorite color for your house is not the favorite color for your car. It's not the favorite color for your omelet. But if I had to pick a color, I would say it's BYU blue. All right. Any other questions? Great question. All right. Thanks for coming. See you on Wednesday. Class dismissed. All right. I'm going to change this from active workbook to this workbook. And let me run the code to there and see if it binds on. So we're going to delete the worksheet. I'm going to run to this point. And let's see if PC is bound to something. Yeah, and those are the pivot cache. So I'm not sure why it needs this workbook instead of active workbook. Seems like that should have worked, but it works fine with this workbook. So now I should be able to build multiple pivot tables. So even, get rid of stop here, even with no data set on it, even with the data sets on it, should be able to produce another table. It does, got 10 and 11. But without a pivot table, that'll get rid of the pivot caches that go with those. And if I run that, it should still go through and build the pivot cache and the pivot table. So yeah, that was it. This workbook instead of active workbook. Kind of a surprise to me. All right, that's it.